Captain Midnight.
I have spent a lot of time discussing comic book movies on this channel. Spider-Man, X-Men, Batman, Ant-Man and the Wasp. I've made videos on so many of these characters. So it just feels wrong that I haven't even touched on the Blade franchise, which kick-started the Marvel film and, in many ways, laid the foundation for comic book movies to become the most dominant genre of film kind of this century. So instead of just doing one video, I teamed up with some other YouTubers to cover the whole trilogy. High Top Films is talking about the first movie, I've got the second, and Godzilla Mendoza has a really funny video tackling everyone's favorite, Trinity. I'll include a link to their videos in my description, which you should definitely check out because these guys have a ton to say about the franchise. But I'm here to talk about Guillermo del Toro's Blade 2, the biggest box office hit of the franchise, but a film that seems to not be held in super high regard by a lot of critics out there, especially recently. I'll be honest, going back to it for the first time in about a decade, I was a little worried about whether it would hold up at all. And the answer to that question turned out to be a lot more complicated and surprisingly more fun than I was expecting.
Keep your friends close. Keep your enemies closer. Ooh, so exciting.
So let's get one thing clear up front. Blade 2 is the most 2002 movie possible. Coming to it now in 2020, that's basically inescapable. From the soundtrack to the CG to the set design, this is not a movie that tries to distance itself from the period it was made in at all. And I can see a lot of people looking at that as a drawback. And in some ways, I would agree. On the CG especially. Not in the monster design, which I still think holds up really well, but in the action scenes. While a lot of the fight choreography and the way the action is framed is still as exciting as it ever was, characters are constantly turning into shiny rubber ball versions of themselves for a few seconds. It's kind of like a more noticeable CG version of action scenes where they cut to a wide shot and it's just painfully clear there's like a stunt double there instead of actors, which was something that plagued fellow vampire slayer Buffy in that show a lot. Here though, it's like that very specific kind of early 2000s CG that I really associate with like the first Spider-Man film and 2003's Hulk, where the characters feel a little weightless at times. So okay, that might annoy you more than it does me, but honestly, it's just hardly a deal breaker. And the soundtrack and the set design are, if anything, huge assets. I don't care what year it came out, when Mos Def and Massive Attack's Eye Against Eye kicks in, that's still a great moment. The movie has a lot of interesting visual influences as well. While it shares a lot of the late 90s music video look of the first film, and I mostly mean that in a positive way, Del Toro expands on that a lot too. From the giant, highly detailed sets that you hardly ever see in action movies anymore, to the Reapers clearly getting their look from the silent classic Nosferatu, this is a really fun balance between Del Toro's usual sensibilities and the over-the-top world established by that first movie. Dated or not, it still really works for me. But all of that aside, what about the story and the characters? At the time of release, critics were pretty harsh on Blade 2, with many calling it basically just a mindless gore fest. Well, except Roger Ebert, he was really into both movies. And I gotta say, after rewatching it, I think there's a lot more going on here than it was given credit for. I'll start with the negatives though. The way the movie brings back Whistler is pretty forced and inelegant, with Blade basically giving this long, previously on Blade, voiceover speech. It negates a pretty powerful scene in the first film, all in service of bringing the character back. And I'm kinda torn on this. While I'm not a fan of undercutting that scene in the original Blade, I'm also more than happy to have Whistler back. His relationship with Blade really humanizes a character that could easily be so larger than life that he doesn't even seem recognizably human. With Whistler though, there's a clear human connection there that gives Blade a sense of family and purpose. Plus, Chris Christopherson is really funny here. Like, I would argue that he's more enjoyable here than he was in the first one. And I would have really hated to have missed out on that. Plus, Christopherson wrote Sunday Morning Coming Down, which is like a top 5 Johnny Cash song, so, you know, give him all the work he wants. A bigger problem though is Lenore Varilla as Nisa, the film's female lead. This is a role with a ton of potential, which I'll get into later, but for now I'll say that I don't quite think she was up to the task. She's really stiff here, and I never quite buy her chemistry with Snipes. Those are probably my biggest issue with the movie, but honestly, they feel so easily outweighed by what the film does right. The screenwriter of Blade 2, David Goyer, has written some really rough scripts, Batman v Superman and the sequel to this movie being great examples, but forget that. I don't care. Someone give this man a Nobel Prize in Literature for writing a movie where Blade has to lead a team of vampires who have trained for 2 years to kill him. This is about as fun of a setup as you could ask for in a Blade film, and the movie doesn't waste it. The obvious standout on the team is Ron Perlman's Reinhard, who emerges as probably the most interesting of the film's many villains. But I really do like the rest of them too. They feel like a JRPG party of cool weirdos, with a fun mixture of looks and skills. Donnie Yen as the silent sword-wielding vampire didn't have all that much to do, but he was so well used in action scenes. Lighthammer has an awesome face tattoo, Priest has this great Scottish accent but then dies almost immediately. Now, I'll admit these are hardly like deep, sketched out characters, but they help fill out this colorful world really well. Ron Perlman, though, is in a class of his own. His might be my favorite character in the film. Like the rest of the team, basically no time is devoted to his backstory, but everything we need to know about him is right there in Perlman's performance. Reinhard is a sadist. It's that simple. While so many other characters in the film have big evil plans with like global consequences, Reinhard is clearly pretty bored with all of that. He just wants to inflict pain. Period. This could be really boring. I often find characters like this very one note. But Perlman brings a pretty interesting edge to it. He doesn't chew the scenery. Instead, he makes the most of every little vindictive moment he's given. I love when the team is in the sewers and he neglects to tell Blade that the bomb's detonator stick isn't working until the very last minute. Just the sheer joy he gets out of screwing over our hero is a ton of fun to watch. I also love that at the end of the day, he does have a really overinflated opinion of himself. When facing Blade in a one-on-one fight, he gets absolutely annihilated like almost immediately. It's a great note for this character to end on because he's definitely someone who thought of himself as like a huge badass, and at the end of the day, his entire bag of tricks was basically just being a sneaky asshole with a huge ego. The other villains are a lot of fun too though. The head of the vampires, Eli, is a little one note, but at least it's an interesting one. The Reapers that he sent Blade and company after are actually the products of his own genetic experiments. His reasoning works pretty well too. He's trying to create a version of vampires with none of the weaknesses, giving them immunity to silver and sunlight and a rock-hard bone defending the heart from stakes. And he's willing to sacrifice anyone on a whim, including his own daughter, to do it. But that's also part of my biggest problem with the character. His relationship with Nisa and Nisa herself are just undercooked. Honestly, I think she needed a more active role in the narrative. She feels betrayed by her father, but other than complaining and not comforting him when he's basically already lost, she doesn't really get to make a big active choice to turn her back on him and join Blade's side. Don't get me wrong, by the end it's clear that she's done that, but I think a better actress could have brought a lot more emotional dimension to that choice. And a few scenes with her and her dad together before she realized how disposable she was to him also would have gone a long way towards selling this betrayal. For us to feel anything for her in that moment, they needed to show us why she had any loyalty to him in the first place. As for Nomak, the main Reaper, he's fine, but the real star of the show is just how well designed these Reapers are. One of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is that nasty autopsy scene, where they open up a Reaper just to see how it functions. This is where that pure Del Toro quality shines. When they drop a little blood in it and reveal the body is still eating itself alive, when I think of Blade 2, this is probably the first image that pops into mind. But so far, I haven't even talked about the man himself, Wesley Snipes, the perfect 90s and 2000s action star. What I love about Snipes' performance is how sincere it feels. Blade gets to say all of these over-the-top lines and badass catchphrases, but he never plays it with even a hint of winking or irony. Blade constantly finds himself in the most insane and honestly goofy situations, and you never get the feeling that he's taking any of this lightly. Blade doesn't even have that many lines, but Snipes hits every one of them like he's playing King Lear, bringing to the role a real sense of gravitas that makes it a lot more fun than if he was undermining it by playing him more over the top. From what I've read, Snipes is not an easy person to work with, especially on the movie after this, but I can clearly see why he landed the role in the first place. Like, I love Mahershala Ali, and I look forward to his MCU Blade, but this feels like the role Snipes was born to play. And some of the character's best moments are in this film. Del Toro shoots him falling and then rising out of that pool of blood in such a fun way. Like, you know it's coming, but it only makes it that much more satisfying. My favorite moment, though, is when he turns the table on Norman Reedus' Scud. Scud working for the vampires was already a good twist, because I think the first half of the film really does sell you on their friendship and Reedus' easygoing charm. But the second twist, that Blade knew he was evil and planned for it all along, which, by the way, he reveals as he blows Scud to pieces, that is B-movie perfection. Exactly the kind of gory good time I want out of a film like this.
Vampires.
From the writer of Batman Begins and the creators of the Blade trilogy.
I'm not going to pretend that Blade 2 is the most thematically complex or flawless film out there. It's not. But Raimi's Spider-Man movies aside, I consider it the most compulsively watchable of the early 2000s comic book films. And that definitely includes heavy hitters like X2. It balances its action and its vampire lore in a way that never makes one overshadow the other. Something that may look easy, but that stuff like the Underworld series could almost never manage to pull off. Blade 2 isn't Del Toro's best movie, and it's far from his most critically respected. But it is a great example of what can happen when a director with a unique vision tackles a franchise and puts his own spin on it. It's everything you would want in a Blade movie and a Del Toro film all at once. And I think it deserves to be remembered as one of the most fun comic book movies ever made.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.